chewed out of the inside of it because that would make it noisy. Here's our balk ring. You can see how that's tapered, and the balk ring fits onto there. Now, a good balk ring, we should be able to put it onto there and give it a tap, and it shouldn't come off again. This one's not too good. Okay, so we need to fix that up a bit. What we do have to be careful of is, you see the space between these teeth and these teeth? It's called back clearance on the cone. If we lap it and we take all the back clearance out, then it's buggered, right? It's not going to work. So we only do a very small amount of lapping.
So there should be space between them?
Yes, there should be a gap in there. They'd actually give you a specification in there of what the minimum gap is. We'll examine that in a second. Okay, let's destroy a bit more of it. Now we'll take our counter gear out.
This is reverse.
Yep. Sorry, that's reverse. Yeah.
And what's that?
What's that? That's reverse gear as well. Okay, we have. What we do is we have. Yeah, you need an extra cog to make a change of direction. So the way this one works is these two are together, and then what happens is that when we go for reverse, this one slides into mesh on the outside. So what we do is clockwise from the input shaft, anti-clockwise, clockwise, anti-clockwise, so we get our change of direction. Whereas normally when we're driving, yeah, the output's through there because it's splined to the shaft. Let's just put this underneath for a minute so we can put our gears together so we can see what they look like when they run together. Right, where's our input shaft?
He's got it.
Oh, yeah. Oh, sorry. Staring it in the face. Okay. Blind in one eye, can't see out the other. Okay, we'll put that into there. So in the car, it sits like that. And our reverse idler sits out to the side a little bit. Okay, and then this gear will be facing this way, and that slides in and out of mesh. You can see these are what we call straight cut teeth. You can see how they're straight compared to these ones on angle. Yes, spur is another name for them. Straight cut. You can see because the person doesn't always stop the gearbox, they're a little bit chewed on the edge of the teeth there. Being a non-synchronised gear, and you can see the chips on the edge of the idler gear, all those around there. Being a non-synchronised gear, we've got to slide these into mesh together. Very early gearboxes, these sorts of spur gears were all the same. So every time we changed gear, we had to slide these in. So you can appreciate it was difficult to get them so that it didn't go crunch, crunch a little bit. The secret with an modern gearbox is because reverse gear isn't synchronised, what you do is before you put it in reverse, you pull it into second gear first, and that stops the gearbox turning internally, and then you pull it into reverse gear, and then you don't get all those horrible crunches and groans and everything. So, power flow. When we go to select things, when we go into first gear, this hub moves across and it locks this gear to the output shaft, so the drive comes in through the input shaft, down to the counter-driven gear, along the counter shaft to counter shaft first gear, and now to main shaft first gear. So we're driving from the smallest gear to the biggest gear, so we've got a reduction in ratio, because this one can go whiz, 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 and this one will only go once. Okay, so we get a lower ratio. When we change into second gear, we move this sleeve backwards to lock this gear, second gear, to the main shaft. So we go input from input shaft, counter gear, driven gear, counter gear, second gear, main shaft, second gear, and out. Not quite as big a difference in the size difference between the gears, the two gears.
These always touching on
yes,
the gears.
constant mesh.
These that makes it like
lock it up.
Lock up.
That's it.
Okay.
Because these are locked to the shaft.
Yeah.
Like so. The gears are free to spin on the shaft.
Yeah.
So we go second gear, our drive comes up through there.
What was it called? The synchromesh is what does the locking, or?
No, the sleeve, which is splined to a hub inside, and it slides over the gear.
Okay.
When we go into third gear, we move this sleeve backwards to lock third gear to the shaft, come in through the input shaft, counter driven gear, counter third gear, output shaft third gear. So all the time these output gears are getting progressively smaller, so that means it needs less turns of this gear to get a turn out of that gear. Okay.
So which one's primary and which one's secondary?
I don't like those terms because they're more front-wheel drive transmissions than these. But we have input shaft, counter gear, cluster gear, and we have output shaft here.
Oh, okay.
Front-wheel drive transmissions, we tend to have a primary gear and a secondary gear. In a front-wheel drive transmission, if we were really looking at it, this bit sits on this one, so that makes it the primary shaft, and then we output through the secondary shaft.
Oh,
So that's where the difference lies. That's why I don't want to use those particular terms with this type of transmission. When we go into top gear, fourth gear, it's a 1-to-1 gear ratio. So all we do is slide this sleeve forward, and we just simply lock this shaft to this shaft, so we have a direct drive straight through the transmission. From a diagnostics point of view, this transmission, when we're in any of the indirect gears where we're driving down, along and up again, because the teeth are meshing together, there's a separating load pushing them apart. So that puts a radial load on all these bearings here. So you sometimes find, especially with the rear bearing, it'll be noisy in this case first, second and third, and you put it into fourth gear and it goes quiet, because by locking those together, this gear's now just idling over. Well, it's just idling over, but it's not doing any driving. So we take that radial separating load away, and we say, okay, well, now we know that it's probably one of these bearings because it's noisy. Now, this output shaft bearing will be quiet when the car's idling, when you just got it sitting there in neutral. First, second and third will be noisy. It'll go quiet in fourth gear. These bearings here will tend to be noisy in the intermediate gears as well, first, second, third. But you also usually get a bit of bearing noise out of them when the car's sitting there in neutral and the engine's running, because again we've got some sort of separating load, and you can quiet them down by putting your foot in the clutch, stopping the gearbox from moving because you're stopping this input shaft moving, and that reduces the noise a bit.
There's one gear is not, the teeth are, step by step they are, what you can say, if we can, this, you can replace just one gear if you want.
Yep, you've got to place this as a unit, because you can see it's all manufactured in one unit, so you get to replace the whole of that. But these gears here, you can replace them singly, and you can replace this one singly. Normally, if there's something goes wrong with the gear, it's usually damaged the gear that it meshes with. Not always, but sometimes. You know, I've had them where they just break a tooth off.
shoot.
Yeah, it happens. Just break a tooth off. I don't know.
To replace that,
Go to the
you
dentist.
can open this and you can get
Yeah.
this gear out.
We'll pull these all to pieces in a second. So we're going to look inside.
Get some
Because we've also
dentures.
got to inspect the teeth, and what we're looking for on the teeth is if we've got any funny marks on the faces here. So if we get any indentations, like they've had a really big shock loading, so you know, maybe as I said, a diff's locked up or something, so it puts dents in the teeth, which will make it noisy. We can also get little pop marks appearing in, so the hardening starts to go on the gear, and that will make them noisy as well. We have a golden rule with the gearboxes that you never pull it down until you've driven it in the car and you know basically what it sounds like, so you've got an idea that if there's a particular problem, you can go looking for that problem, because it's always a good idea to confirm what you heard and what you suspected when you pull a gearbox down. I had a mate of mine had a Series 1 RX-7 and yeah, he had a Series 1, I had a Series 2. Anyway, he comes around and he says, oh look, the gearbox needs new bearings there, can you do it? And I said, yeah, that's all right. So we whip it, you know, down the drive, so dummy, I didn't drive the car, so I said, yeah, that's all right. Threw it up on the jack stands, ripped the gearbox out, stripped it down, it's a 5-speed, put a set of bearings in it, you know, and as we pulled them down, I always clean the bearings and look at them, and there's nothing wrong with them. And I said to him, we haven't found the problem, there's nothing wrong with these bearings. Oh no, that's what it'll be. I said, trust me, there's nothing wrong with these bearings. I've not seen anything that tells me it's a crook bearing. Put it back in the car, bloody thing's noisy, isn't it? Pull it back out again, and it was these gears here. And when I looked at it really closely, once I'd driven it, with a gear noise, you can do a thing called floating. Okay, so when we're driving the car, when the engine's driving the gearbox, we've got load on one side. When we back off the throttle and the weight of the car's driving the engine, we've got load on the other side. And we get a period called float, where you're driving down the road and you just very gently come off the throttle. So instead of the engine driving it, or the car driving the engine, you just get this period where the teeth really don't have any load on them. You can sort of just ease the throttle up and down like this to get what we call float. So as soon as it's got a gear noise, usually they're either noisy on drive or overrun, usually on drive, and you'll float the noise out of it. And that's all we can do with a transmission. We can change its temperature to a certain extent, which just changes the thickness of the oil. We can change the load on it, so are we accelerating or are we coasting and backing off? Or we can change the speed of the gearbox, so we can drive it at different speeds in different gears. As soon as I drove it, it had a drive noise, and it was there in all the gears bar fourth gear. So it was all the intermediate ratios, 1, 2, 3 and 5, where we were driving down and it had a noise in it, and I thought, bingo, it's got to be this gear and that gear. And when I pulled it down and really got in with a magnifying glass and looked at it, hey, presto, I could see a couple of the marks in there. That's what was wrong with it. You know? And I broke my own golden rule because I thought he knew what he was talking about. dummy. I thought he knew what he was talking about, so I said, yeah, not a problem. I would put a set of bearings in, out it comes, get the workshop in your land. Oh, yes, bang, pull it to pieces. So, of course, we had to pull it down a second time. So you always try and diagnose them, find out what's wrong with it. We'll pull the lay shaft out of here in a minute and take the 10,000 metre rollers out of there. What goes wrong with these particular gearboxes is that this shaft is physically not big enough in diameter. Just like that. It's not physically big enough in diameter. And when you put lots of power for it, especially when they put them behind V8s, what they did was that under the power the shaft actually bent. If you looked at the equivalent ball Warner box that they put in the Falcon, the shaft was about twice the diameter, and they just didn't have the troubles with them. So they were a good gearbox behind a 4-cylinder, they're a good gearbox behind a 6-cylinder, but boy, when you got them into a V8, they were just shockers, and they just used to chew these out all the time.
How it went?
Yep. They just chew it out all the time, and you can see how this has been stained here because it's been put back together and it's sat a reasonable time, but there's no signs of actually
reverse.
just...
Was the reverse one on that?
No, the reverse one's on this one. This is just a straight shaft.
And where does this go?
Yeah, just don't lose all those
That one
because they
goes
go
up
into here.
And that one goes in here.
Yeah, that's right.
Which one?
Don't worry about putting it back in. We'll just leave it there now. I'll pull those out.
Other than that, put grease, which one was this?